This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and far more dangerous. What happens when the federal government stops functioning as a neutral system and starts behaving like a gatekeeper? When access to money, protection, and basic stability is no longer automatic but conditional. Not on law, not on eligibility. On loyalty, you don't see it all at once. You feel it in pauses, in delays, in programs that still exist on paper, but no longer reach you the same way. This isn't chaos, it's structure. A system learning how to punish without announcing that it's doing so. And here's the uncomfortable part. By the time it feels personal, the mechanism is already normalized. If you want to understand how that normalization happens quietly, legally, and at scale, stay with me. Because the story doesn't start where the damage is visible. It starts where control quietly changed hands. What actually controls the system right now is not ideology. It's leverage. Power isn't exercised through speeches or legislation first. It moves through pipes, through grants, through approvals, through the quiet ability to say yes, later, or no, indefinitely. For decades, federal power was messy but predictable. States fought. Agencies argued. Money flowed according to statute. That assumption no longer holds. The center of gravity has shifted away from lawmaking and toward administration, not what Congress passes, but how, when, and to whom it is implemented. This is the difference between governing outcomes and governing access. Outcomes can be challenged. Access is harder to see. If funding depends on discretion, discretion becomes authority. And authority without visibility becomes control. That's the system now taking shape. Not loudly, not uniformly, but selectively. And once selectivity becomes normal, neutrality becomes optional. Which raises the next question, when did this start feeling normal? And why didn't it trigger alarms at the time? There was a time when federal money was boring, predictable, slow. Before, if a state qualified, it received funding, not because it was liked, but because it met the rules. That wasn't trust, that was design. What changed wasn't the law, it was the tempo. Small delays became routine. Reviews took longer. Approvals gained new layers. Nothing was announced. Nothing was revoked outright. And that's why it worked. Because the most dangerous changes don't arrive as shocks. They arrive as adjustments, as case-by-case decisions, as exceptions that quietly stack over time. Eligibility stopped being the finish line. It became the starting point. After that came something new. A second test, unwritten, unpublished. Are you aligned? Are you cooperative? Are you worth the trouble? Once that logic sets in, the system hasn't broken. It has evolved. And when evolution goes unnoticed, reversal becomes almost impossible. Because the next step isn't denial, it's punishment. And that's where this moves next. At first, it showed up as a pause, then as a freeze. Billions of dollars, already approved, already appropriated, already promised for clean energy projects across the country. And then suddenly, not everywhere, some states kept the money, others didn't. Not because the projects failed, not because the rules changed, but because the map changed. Who voted where? That was the filter. This wasn't old school favoritism. This was something colder. Resources maintained for loyalty, resources withdrawn as warning. And for a moment, it almost worked until the admission became public, until the court stepped in, until judges said clearly, this is illegal. Because once federal money becomes conditional on politics, it stops being federal. It becomes tribute. The ruling blocked the cuts. The projects resumed. The headlines moved on. But the important thing didn't disappear. The attempt happened at scale, deliberately. And once a system tries something this large and survives the backlash, it learns. If you're still watching, you already understand why this wasn't a one-off, Because when this fails in one place, the pressure doesn't stop. It looks for a softer target, and it finds one. Here's the mechanism that makes all of this possible. And it's simpler than it sounds. Congress writes the check, but the executive controls the clock. Appropriations don't move themselves. They move through agencies, through offices, through administrators who decide sequence, priority, and urgency. That's where power concentrates. If money is delayed, it's not technically denied. If a grant is under review, it still exists. If funding is frozen temporarily, no statute has been violated on paper. This is how punishment hides inside process. The states that comply don't notice anything wrong. Their funds arrive on time. Their projects proceed. The system appears intact. The states that don't comply absorb the damage. Budgets wobble. Contractors wait. Programs stall. No announcement is required. No order needs to be signed. The benefit flows upward, control without fingerprints, leverage without accountability. And the cost flows downward to governors, to agencies, to families who never voted on any of this. This is why courts become the choke point. Because once discretion replaces uniformity, law stops being self-enforcing. And when the judiciary blocks one tactic, the pressure doesn't disappear. It reroutes faster, sharper, toward places where the damage is harder to quantify. And that's where this accelerates next. This time, there was no pause, no paperwork delay, no quiet review. It was immediate. Funding cut, grants canceled, relationships severed. Not because the work failed, but because the criticism landed, a professional institution spoke out publicly, bluntly, and the response wasn't debate, it was erasure. Money gone, programs frozen, a message sent without being written down. This is how speed replaces subtlety. When discretion isn't fast enough, retaliation takes over. You criticize, you lose access. You dissent, you disappear from the ledger. For a moment, that worked too. Silence spread faster than outrage ever could. Until a judge stepped in, illegal retaliation. That was the phrase. Funding restored. Lines redrawn. But notice the pattern. The system keeps testing how far it can go, how fast it can move, how much damage it can do before someone stops it. And every test leaves residue. Fear, self-censorship, preemptive compliance. Because even when the courts reverse the action, the warning remains. And the next target isn't an institution. It's you. This is where it stops being abstract. Because you don't experience federal power as a theory, you experience it as timing, as availability, as whether help shows up when it's supposed to. Childcare funding doesn't feel partisan when you need it. Housing assistance doesn't feel ideological when rent is due. Medical guidance doesn't feel political when someone you love is sick. But when those systems become conditional, the impact lands on you first. Not as an announcement, as a gap. A program that still exists but can't take new cases. A benefit that's approved but hasn't arrived. A service that works everywhere except where you live. And you're told it's administrative, temporary, under review. That's the pressure point. Because the cost of resistance is no longer theoretical. It's personal. If this sounds familiar, don't look away. This is the part of the story that's easiest to ignore and hardest to reverse. Stay with me. Because what starts as selective pressure at home doesn't stay contained. It spreads. Once a system proves it can reward and punish internally, it doesn't stay domestic for long. Because markets notice, allies notice, investors notice. When infrastructure projects can be halted for political reasons, capital recalculates risk. When scientific funding becomes conditional, data credibility erodes. When election administration is threatened financially, democratic legitimacy weakens everywhere. This isn't theoretical. Supply chains depend on predictability. Energy grids depend on continuity. Global partners depend on rules that don't change with maps. When they do, confidence fractures. A wind project stopped here doesn't just cost jobs locally. It signals volatility globally. It tells the world that long-term commitments in this system are provisional. And once that signal is sent, it doesn't retract easily. Other governments begin hedging, other currencies begin absorbing risk, other alliances start planning around instability. The ripple isn't loud, it's cumulative. And here's the danger. When instability becomes priced in, reversal becomes expensive. When credibility erodes, enforcement requires force instead of trust. At that point, the system isn't failing. It's hardening, and hardened systems don't bend back smoothly. Which brings us to what happens next. When this pressure stops moving sideways and starts moving forward in time. From here, there are only three paths forward. Not outcomes, paths. The first is adjustment. Institutions adapt just enough. Courts intervene faster. Congress blocks more aggressively. The system holds, but at a cost. Governance slows. Everything becomes litigated. Nothing moves without friction. It survives, but it no longer breathes easily. The second path is erosion. Selective enforcement becomes routine. Delays normalize. Retaliation hides inside process. No single act triggers collapse. Instead, trust thins. Participation drops. Compliance becomes conditional on fear, not belief. The system still exists, but fewer people rely on it. And fewer people defend it. Then there's the third path, rupture. That's when leverage turns into open coercion. When courts are ignored, when funding threats escalate, when elections themselves become bargaining chips. Rupture doesn't announce itself. It arrives as a standoff no one backs away from. And here's the part we can't resolve yet. All three paths are already visible. At the same time, in different places, under different pressures. Which one dominates doesn't depend on intent. It depends on resistance, on timing, on who blinks first. And that brings us to the ending. Not a conclusion, but a warning that doesn't close cleanly. There's a temptation at this point to feel reassured. Courts blocked the cuts. Congress pushed back. Projects resumed. Funds were restored. That temptation is the risk. Because systems don't reveal their direction in defeats. They reveal it in what they keep trying. Every blocked attempt leaves behind knowledge. What slowed things down? What triggered intervention? What didn't? And that knowledge compounds. What you're watching isn't collapse. It's calibration. A system learning how far it can go without triggering alarms. How to apply pressure without leaving fingerprints. How to turn law into friction instead of force. Nothing here ends cleanly. There's no final ruling that solves it. No election that resets the incentive overnight. The danger is unfinished, deliberately. So the real question isn't whether this system survives. It's whether it survives as something you still recognize. If you stop paying attention, you don't miss a headline. You miss the moment when conditional governance becomes default. And once that happens, getting it back isn't a matter of outrage. It's a matter of rebuilding leverage from scratch. This story doesn't end here. It continues in budgets, in courts, in delays you're told are temporary. If you want to understand where this goes next and what breaks when it finally goes too far, that's the next conversation we need to have.